The envelope was already in my hand when Whitney walked through the door. Not a greeting card, not a bill. A letter. My own handwriting on the outside, the ink the particular blue of a fountain pen I'd used only once and then put away, because the color reminded me too much of something I didn't want to think about every morning. The letter had been folded and refolded so many times the creases had gone soft, nearly transparent. I'd pressed it flat against my palm and I could feel the ghost of every fold through my skin, the way you can feel an old scar long after it's healed. I set it on the kitchen table, the white oak table. Herschel built the spring of 2004, the one with the small gouge in the lower left corner where he'd slipped with the chisel and said a word he didn't know I heard. I set the letter there, and I waited. She came in talking. Whitney always comes in talking. Keys still jangling, purse sliding off one shoulder, a sentence already half finished before the door is fully open. Something about traffic. Something about how she'd had to park 2 blocks down because the Hendersons were having people over. I didn't hear the words because I wasn't listening for the words. I was watching her eyes find the envelope. She stopped, just for a beat, just long enough. "Mom," she said, "what is that?" Not a question. An accusation already forming before she'd decided what to accuse me of. That's a thing I had noticed about my daughter, somewhere in her 30s when her father was still alive and I had someone to mention it to quietly over dinner. She had started to say sentences that sounded like questions but were structured like verdicts. "Sit down, Whitney," I said. She sat, "and I want you to understand something." I had not raised my voice. I had not slid the envelope toward her dramatically. I had not done anything, really, except stand in my own kitchen in the particular stillness I have spent 69 years learning to occupy. There is a kind of quiet that is merely the absence of sound, and there is a kind of quiet that takes up room. I have been practicing the second kind since before she was born. But let me back up, because you need to understand what that envelope had been through to get back to my kitchen table. And you need to understand what I am before you can understand what it means that someone decided I was clutter. I have been a seamstress for 40 years, not a hobbyist, not a woman who quilts for church bazaars and accepts compliments, with her hands folded in her lap. I ran Aldridge Alterations on Fenwick Street from 1984 until I retired at 65, and in those 40 years, I altered wedding gowns and military dress uniforms, and the confirmation suits of boys who later brought their sons to me. I worked on a prom dress for a girl who came back 11 years later with that same dress, let out at the seams, wanting to wear it to her mother's funeral. I said nothing, just measured, just pinned, just did what needed doing with my hands. There are things you learn when you spend your life working with fabric. One of them is that what holds something together is almost always invisible. The seam is on the inside, the stitching that keeps the whole garment from falling apart. You're not supposed to see it. That's what makes it work. Herschel understood this about me, even though he worked in concrete. He poured foundations for 26 years for Bartlett Construction, and sometimes at night I'd find him looking at his hands the way I looked at mine, like they were a separate kind of intelligence from the rest of him. We had 31 years together before the second stroke took him, and I can tell you that in 31 years the man never once asked me where anything was, because he trusted that I knew where everything was. He didn't always understand what I was doing, but he trusted that I was doing something. There is a difference. I have spent a good part of the last 4 years understanding just how large a difference it is. Whitney is my oldest. She is 43 now, with dark hair that she keeps shorter than she used to, since she made partner at the consulting firm where she works, as though authority requires less of it. She calls on Sunday evenings when she thinks to, and texts the rest of the time, quick, efficient messages that begin mid-thought the way her phone calls do. She gets this from Herschel, that quality of always being mid-project, always carrying the momentum of the thing she was just doing into the room where you are. On Herschel, it was an endearing quality. On Whitney, it is sometimes hard to distinguish from not fully arriving. Brandon is 3 years younger than Whitney, lives in Tucson, calls every Sunday at 2 o'clock Mountain Time without fail, and I have never once had to explain to Brandon why I do something. He just asks what I need. It's the difference between children who watched you and children who were busy being watched. Brandon watched. He has his father's patience and his grandmother's eyes, and he works in water resource management for the state of Arizona, which is the kind of work that requires thinking 30 years ahead. And this has made him a particular kind of person, someone who understands that most of what matters is underground. Whitney is brilliant. I need you to hear me say that without qualification, and I need you to hear me say it before I tell you the rest, because it is easy to make a story about a daughter who sells her mother's things at a garage sale into a simple story, a clean story with a villain and a victim and a tidy reckoning at the end. That is not the story I'm telling. Whitney has a master's degree in organizational management, which is the study of how to make complicated systems run efficiently, and she is very good at it. She can look at any mess, a filing system, a budget, a moving timeline, a household that has accumulated 40 years of two people's lives, and see exactly what belongs and what can go. The problem is that she has never fully understood the difference between what can go and what wants to be gone. She loves me. I need to say that too. Whatever happens in this story, whatever you think of her by the end of it, she loves me in the large, imprecise way of people who have not yet learned to love carefully. She has always been afraid that love was something you could run out of if you weren't efficient about it. Where that fear came from, I'm not entirely sure. It wasn't from her father, and it wasn't from me. Some fears are just original to a person. Her father died on a Tuesday morning in October of 2019, and by the following Saturday she had a notepad. I didn't fight her on the notepad. Grief takes different shapes, and hers had always been the shape of action. She listed things, sorted things, called the funeral home, called the insurance company, called her brother, called the pastor, called the newspaper for the obituary notice. She stood at the center of every practical transaction of those first weeks, and she managed them cleanly, and I was grateful, truly, genuinely grateful. Because there is so much to manage when a person dies, and grief does not make managing it easier, and someone has to. I sat in mine. She moved through hers. I let her manage. I let her schedule the estate attorney and sort the paperwork and organize the garage so that Herschel's tools were boxed up in a way that made sense. The hand tools in one box, the power tools labeled, the lumber he'd been saving since 2017 for the bookcase he never got to build, donated to a neighbor who said he would use it. I signed what needed signing and nodded when she talked and let her feel useful because useful was what she needed to be. I watched her move through Herschel's belongings with her clipboard and her colored tabs. Green for keep, blue for donate, yellow for ask mom. And I thought, she thinks this is the whole of what he left. She did not ask about the sewing room. Nobody ever asked about the sewing room. In 40 years, almost nobody came into that room except by invitation. It smelled of the cedar blocks I kept on the shelves, and machine oil, and the faint, dusty sweetness of new fabric just off the bolt. And underneath those things, the older smell that I cannot name, except to say it is the smell of work done over many years in the same place. The Bernina sat on its table by the north window. The older model with the cast-iron flywheel I had replaced only once, and the throat plate worn to a particular smoothness under my right hand that I would recognize anywhere, even in the dark. Around it were the things I had accumulated over decades of working. The thread rack Herschel had built me out of dowel rods and a plank of scrap pine, the fabric bolts sorted by weight and then by color, the wooden box of buttons that had no match for anything in particular, but that I could not bring myself to throw out because every one of them had come off something that was already gone. The foot pedal cord had been taped at one point, years ago, with black electrical tape, and the tape had dried and half lifted at one end, and I had never replaced it because it worked, and because the sight of it, that small domestic repair, was somehow comforting to me. A thing that had been fixed and continued. On the shelf above the Bernina, folded with the good side in to protect the fabric from the light, was the quilt. I should tell you about the quilt, because the quilt is the center of this whole story, and because you probably think you already know what kind of quilt I'm talking about. You're imagining something pretty, something grandmotherly, log cabin blocks maybe, or the double wedding ring pattern, the kind of thing that gets displayed on a rack at a craft fair with a price tag that makes people inhale quietly and then move on. The kind of quilt you'd picture if someone said, a seamstress of 40 years made a quilt, something with intention to its beauty, something you'd recognize as valuable the moment you saw it, That's not what this was. The quilt was made from scraps. Not artfully selected scraps, not curated remnants arranged by someone who knew what they were doing and was trying to make something beautiful. This was the material of 40 years of working, pieces of things that had been cut away from other things, the triangles and odd corners and end strips that are the ordinary refuse of tailoring work, upholstery fabric from a chair repair project in 1991, lining silk from a bridesmaid dress that came to me in 1996, a peculiar coral color that I had never liked, but that was part of what was there, so I used it. The particular weight of wool suiting that doesn't have a name, but that my hands knew on contact, charcoal and navy, and a brown-black that had been the sleeve of a man's sport coat I'd relined sometime in the late 80s, flannel from curtains, cotton from a table runner, a strip of something green and loosely woven that I could no longer identify by 1994 when I added it, only that it had been in the scrap basket long enough that its origin was gone. I had started it the year Herschel and I married, 1981, and I had added to it slowly, sometimes years between editions, the way you add to a thing when you are not making it so much as keeping it. It was ugly by any conventional standard. The colors did not harmonize. The blocks were not consistent in size because I had never cut them to a pattern, just used what was there, the quilting stitches, the ones that ran through all 3 layers to hold the top, to the batting, to the backing. Those were fine and even, because I cannot do work without bringing some discipline to it, but even those could not rescue it aesthetically. You would not hang it on a wall. You would not fold it at the end of a guest bed to impress anyone. Whitney, the one time she had ever looked directly at it, had said, "Mom, what is that?" Not a question. I was beginning to see a pattern. That was 2014. She had come into the sewing room to ask me something. I don't remember what, something about Thanksgiving. And she had noticed it on the shelf and looked at it with the quick assessing glance of someone cataloging a room. I had told her what it was. She had moved on to whatever she'd come in for. She had not asked what was in it. To be fair, and I am trying here to be fair because that is what the story requires. To be fair, why would she? You don't look at an old quilt in your mother's sewing room and ask what might be sewn into the lining. That is not a question that occurs to most people. It occurred to me because I had put it there. It occurred to Roy Hatcher's wife Carol because she had been taught, in a long career of home economics, to feel what's in a thing before you assume you know. For everyone else, a quilt is what it looks like, and what this looked like was old, worn, the textile equivalent of the miscellaneous drawer. But I had made it. Every stitch of it, and because I had made it, I knew exactly what was in it, not just fabric, not just thread. I need to stop there for a moment because I want you to feel the shape of what I knew even before I tell you what it was. I want you to feel what it is like to be in a room with someone who is making decisions about your things, speaking over your things, assigning value to your things, and to be holding quietly the knowledge of what those things actually contain, not as leverage, not as a card you're planning to play, just as knowledge, just as the simple awareness of someone who made a thing and knows it from the inside. I had known since 1987 what was sewn inside the lining of that quilt. I had put it there myself, with the deliberateness of a woman who had been raised to understand that the only safe place for certain things is somewhere no one else would think to look. My mother had taught me this, not as a lesson exactly, more as a demonstration, the way you demonstrate a stitch. Here, watch, you'll understand it better by seeing. Her mother had done the same. In my grandmother's case, it was a small sum of cash in an apron pocket that had been sewn shut. Emergency money, she called it. In my mother's case, it was a set of documents, deed, insurance papers, the certificate of a small savings account kept in a box inside her cedar chest under the linens on the bottom. Not hidden from my father. Hidden from the general uncertainty of a world where women had historically found themselves without access to what was technically theirs. A precaution. A practice. I had updated the practice. I had used the tools available to me. That was all. The family didn't know. Herschel knew. We had agreed on it together in the particular way that married people agree on things without making it a formal decision. He understood, and I understood, and we had spoken of it directly exactly once, in the kitchen on a Thursday evening in late October of 1987, when I told him what I was putting in and where, and he had looked at me for a moment and then nodded and said, "Okay, June." Not okay as in, fine, Whatever you want. Okay, as in, I understand what you're doing and I trust the reason for it, and I will not interfere with your understanding of what we might need. 31 years of marriage, and it was the conversation I keep coming back to when I think about what made us us. The willingness to trust each other's certainty, even when you didn't share the reasoning. We never discussed it again because there was nothing more to discuss. It was simply true, the way a foundation is true. You don't talk about it every year. You don't display it. You just build the house on top of it and live there. Whitney did not know. And here is what I want you to sit with for a moment before I tell you what happened next. I had never lied to my daughter, not once. I had simply not told her everything. Those are two different things, and I believe the difference matters, and I understand that she might not agree, and I am prepared to live with that disagreement. A seam is not a secret. It's structure. It's what holds the layers together. You are not obligated to show every person in your life every seam. The Saturday after Thanksgiving, in the second year after Herschel died, Whitney called me on a Friday evening to let me know she was planning a garage sale. She said she wanted to help me streamline. She used the word carefully, the way she uses words she's thought about in advance. Not streamline as in make more efficient, but streamline as in reduce, shrink, subtract, make the surface of things smaller and more manageable. And she said the house was still very full of Dad's energy, which is the kind of phrase that has enough truth in it that you can't argue with it directly, but which is also doing a different kind of work than it appears to be doing. What she meant was that she found the past uncomfortable to look at, and she was proposing to do something about it. I said I would appreciate knowing what she was planning to put out. She said she would go through things and make some piles, and I should trust her. She said trust her with the briskness of someone who has been trusted all her life and expects to continue being. I should have said, I'll be there. I should have said, nothing leaves this house without me in the room. But I had also, for most of Whitney's adult life, been trying not to be the kind of mother who hovers, who second guesses, who requires constant consultation, who grips. I had spent a good deal of energy maintaining the dignity of someone who trusts her children, because I believe that is something you have to practice. The same as anything. You have to actively practice trust even when it costs you something, or it becomes merely the trust you extend when it's convenient. So I said, all right. I told her to call me if she had questions. She said she would. She did not. I drove to my book club on Saturday morning, and I sat with Marjorie Bellins and the Hoffman sisters, Diane and Patricia, who have been coming to book club since 1999, and who I suspect have never actually read any of the books, but who bring excellent food and whose company I value for entirely other reasons. We were discussing a novel about a woman who inherits a house, which Marjorie found meaningful and which Patricia found overlong, and which Diane had opinions about that she was still developing. And I was listening to them and thinking about nothing in particular, which is a thing book club is for. I had just poured coffee from the carafe on Marjorie's sideboard. The carafe was the old kind, glass with the plastic collar in brown orange, the color of every kitchen accessory from 1978, and it had been on Marjorie's sideboard as long as I had been coming to her house, which was a comfortable thing to know about the world. I looked at the clock because I was going to say I needed to get back soon. I'd been thinking about Herschel's rosebush, the one that had needed pruning since August, and then my phone lit up on the table beside my coffee, and it was Whitney. I thought, something is wrong. Mothers always think that. But the something that was wrong was not the kind of wrong I had imagined. Mom, she said, I just want to give you a heads up. I sold There was a quilt on the shelf in your sewing room. I sold it this morning. I hope that's okay. It was pretty worn. I didn't think you'd want it. It was kind of just sitting there. Someone offered $8 and The coffee in my cup was still steaming. I watched the steam for a moment. How much? I said. A small pause. $8. I set my cup down on Marjorie's sideboard. The saucer made a sound, a small clean clink, the specific register of good china, and Marjorie looked up from her book across the room. Okay, I said. Mom, it really was in rough shape. Okay, Whitney. I hung up. Marjorie was still looking at me with the particular expression of a woman who has known me for 30 years and understands that silence from me is not the same as nothing. She set down her book. She said, June, what happened? Again, not a question. But this time the verdict was concern, not accusation, and I found I could look at her directly. "My daughter just sold something of mine," I said, "at the garage sale." Marjorie waited. She got $8 for it. Marjorie's expression shifted through several things in a moment. Understanding, sympathy, the beginning of outrage on my behalf. She started to say something. "Don't," I said, not unkindly. "I'm still working out what I think. What I did not say, what I did not tell Marjorie that Saturday morning with my coffee going cold on the sideboard, was what that quilt contained. You have to understand, I had not panicked. Panic is for people who have not thought ahead, and I had thought ahead, which is why the thing was there to begin with. The whole point of putting something somewhere safe is that safe means genuinely safe. Not safe, as in well-intentioned, not safe as in probably fine, but safe as in structured to remain safe, even under circumstances you have not anticipated. A quilt sold at a garage sale is $8 to the person who bought it. It does not immediately become something else. People buy old quilts to put on their beds or their porches, or to drape over the back of a sofa. People do not, as a general rule, buy old quilts and immediately unsew the lining. But I had learned, over 69 years, to hold as a general rule carefully. I drove home that afternoon and I walked through the house carefully, the way you walk through a space that has been handled by someone else, noting what was moved, what was shifted, what was gone. Whitney was gone. Thank God. The folding tables already collapsed and stacked against the garage wall, the small handwritten price tags in a neat pile on the kitchen counter, with the cash from the sale rubber-banded beside them, $83 in a mix of bills. She had left a note that said, "Hope this helps. Love you. Talk soon." The exclamation point was very Whitney. I went to my sewing room. The shelf above the Bernina was empty in the way that rooms are empty when something has been removed that belongs there. Not just a bare space, but a wrong space. The way a missing tooth is wrong. The presence of an absence where there should be presence. The cedar block that had sat beside the quilt was still there, which meant she hadn't cleared the shelf completely, just taken the quilt specifically. She had looked at it directly. She had decided. I stood there for a moment. The room smelled the same. Cedar, machine oil, the faint papery smell of the thread spools on the rack Herschel had built. The Bernina sat waiting the way it always sat, the neutral patience of a well-made tool. The light came in from the north window, the flat, even light of a November afternoon that is good for close work because it doesn't cast shadows. I went to the window and looked out at Herschel's garden, which had not been tended properly since he died and which I was slowly, imperfectly learning. The rose bush he had planted in 2016, the one that bloomed yellow in May, and which he had said was the color of the kitchen walls we'd painted our second year in the house. It looked like the color of a promise, he had said at the garden center, holding up the tag, and I had said that was a very good way to describe a yellow, and we had brought it home. By November it was canes and thorns and the memory of green, and it needed more than I had given it, and yet there it was. Still there. Still the shape of what it would be again in May. I thought about the quilt. I thought about where it might be. In the trunk of a stranger's car, in a paper bag on a table folded without ceremony. I thought about what $8 says about how we value what we do not understand. Then I went to my machine, and I sat down, and I put my right hand on the throat plate the way I always do when I'm thinking, just to feel the warmth it held from the afternoon light, and I thought about what to do next. The next day was Sunday. Brandon called it too, mountain time, and I told him. There was a long pause on his end, the kind that means he is choosing words with the care of someone who knows his words, land a certain way with me. "Do you want me to call Whit?" he said. "No," I said. "I don't want anyone to call anyone yet." "Mom." Another pause, the sound of wind through his phone, which meant he was outside, which meant he had stepped out specifically to take my call. "Is there something in the quilt?" This is why I love my son. He doesn't ask what was in the quilt. He asks if there is something, present tense, because he knows me well enough to know that if something existed, it probably still exists, because I would not put something somewhere without having thought through the meaning of the word somewhere. He does not assume that the situation is as simple as it looks. He asks the question that will tell him how to help. "Yes," I said. "Do you need it back?" "Not immediately," I said, "but eventually. He said, "Okay, just that, okay." Like it was entirely reasonable for me to have placed something of consequence inside a quilt in my sewing room, and like the situation was still entirely manageable, despite the quilt having been sold for $8 on a Saturday morning, and like he trusted me to know the difference between a crisis and a complication. That trust, I want you to know, is not a small thing. It is one of the most sustaining things in my life. I spent that week doing what I do when I need to think clearly and cannot think clearly sitting still. I sewed. Not anything new, not anything with stakes. Small work, the kind that keeps the hands occupied and frees the mind for the other thing. I mended a tablecloth with a torn hem that my neighbor Ruth Ann had brought me in September and that I had not gotten to. I finished a pillow cover I'd started before Thanksgiving and set aside. I restrung the thread rack, which didn't need restringing, but which I wanted to do because there is something organizing about putting thread in order by color. It is a task with a clear beginning and a clear end, and a visible result. And sometimes, that is what you need when the larger thing has no visible result yet. I thought about the buyer. I thought about who buys a quilt at a garage sale on a Saturday morning and why. I thought about the particular transaction of it, someone picking it up, feeling the weight, deciding it was worth $8, someone who wanted it for something. What had they wanted it for? On the 5th day after the garage sale, my phone rang at 2:15 in the afternoon. A number I didn't recognize. An area code that was mine. Local. "Is this June Aldridge?" A man's voice. Older. Maybe my age. With the slight roughness of someone who had smoked for a long time and stopped some years back and still carried it at the edges of his vowels. "It is," I said. "My name is Roy Hatcher. I believe I purchased a quilt of yours, ma'am, at a sale last Saturday." I sat down. The chair at the kitchen table, the one that Herschel always sat in, the one I had started sitting in after he died because the room felt more balanced that way. I sat down in it, and I set my free hand flat on the white oak surface of the table, and I waited. "Mr. Hatcher," I said, "what can I do for you?" A pause on his end. I could hear something in the background, a television or a radio. Voices not quite intelligible. Sports, I thought. The cadence of it. "Well, ma'am, I don't quite know how to put this. My wife, she was going to wash it, and when she picked it up, she noticed the lining felt different, stiff in places, like there was something inside it that wasn't just batting." He paused again. "She's a practical woman. She opened a small seam at the corner, just to see, and there was something inside, something that wasn't fabric." He stopped, waiting, I think, for me to react, waiting for surprise, or denial, or explanation. I did not react. "Mr. Hatcher," I said, "could I ask how you found my number?" "The sale was listed on a neighborhood site online," he said. "Your daughter's name was on it as the organizer. I found her in the directory and called her first. She said she didn't know anything about any contents in the quilt and gave me your number. I hope that was all right." So Whitney knew, or knew that someone was calling, which is not the same as knowing what had been found, but close enough to constitute a version of knowing. She knew something had been sewn into the lining. She knew it was enough for a stranger to make 2 phone calls. I filed that information away. "What did you find, Mr. Hatcher?" I said. Though I knew. I had always known. I simply needed to know what he knew. Another pause. Longer. I heard him shift his weight. The particular creak of a recliner, I thought, adjusting. "Bonds, ma'am. Bearer bonds, I think they're called. My grandson helped me look them up because I wasn't sure what they were at first. And there was a letter, handwritten." Another pause, and his voice went quieter. "I didn't read the letter. I want you to know that. I could see it was personal from the look of the handwriting, the way it was addressed. I just set it aside. But the bonds, when I understood what they were, I thought maybe they weren't supposed to be sold with the quilt." "No," I said. "They were not supposed to be sold." "I figured," he said, very quietly, with the tact of a man who had understood, from the first moment he'd made this call, that he had stepped into something that was none of his business, and who was handling that fact with the care of someone who understood the difference between not your business and not your concern. "I want to tell you about Roy Hatcher properly, because he matters to this story, and it is easy to let him pass through it as a device. the person who finds the thing, the person who returns the thing, the person through whom the information flows. He was more than that. He was 63 years old, he told me later when we met. A recently retired mail carrier, 31 years of the same route in the east part of our county, which meant he had spent 3 decades knowing which houses had dogs and which families had moved, and which elderly residents you needed to make sure were actually home before you left a package. He bought the quilt for his wife, Carol, who had been cold the winter before, and who he said loved the weight of old things because they reminded her of her mother's house. He had paid his $8 without haggling. He had not complained about the drive when he came to the diner. He had noticed what Whitney had not noticed. He had carried that noticing to its conclusion. There is something to be said for people who do that. I asked if we could meet, and he said of course whenever I liked, and we agreed on the diner on Callaway 3 days later, the one with the wraparound counter and the coffee that comes too hot and cools over 45 minutes into something perfect. He was already there when I arrived, in a booth by the window, the paper bag folded carefully in the seat beside him. He stood when I came in, not performatively, just because that was what a person did. He handed me the bag. I did not open it at the table. I set it on the seat beside me, and I left it there, and we had coffee, and we talked. He told me about the 31 years of mail delivery, about his 4 grandchildren, about Carol's 22 years of home economics at the high school 2 towns over. I told him about Aldridge alterations, about the Bernina, about the thread rack. He said he had always thought tailoring was work that required an unusual kind of patience. I said it required less patience than the postal service, because fabric never yells at you about a package you didn't lose. He laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that starts in the chest. He said, "If you ever want it back, the quilt." Carol said to tell you she'd rather you have it back. She said it was clear someone had made it for a reason. I looked at him across the table. "Tell Carol that's the most accurate thing anyone has said about it," I said. He nodded. He understood the thing he was nodding to. "She also said to tell you the stitching is beautiful," he said. She could see the smaller stitches in the lining. She said whoever did it had very fine hands. I looked down at my hands around the coffee cup. 69 years old. The knuckle on my right index finger that has been swollen since 2018. The callus on the inside of my right middle finger where the needle rests. The particular shortness of my nails always, because nails catch on thread. "Fine enough," I said. "Now let me tell you what was inside. Herschel and I married young, in the way that people married young then, not because we were careless, but because we already knew. We had both grown up in households where money was not a given, where what you had was what you had managed to hold on to, where the distance between comfortable and precarious was shorter than it appeared from the outside. My mother had taught me a particular respect for that distance. You do not trust the distance. You maintain the distance. You build from the center out, not from the edge in. We had a little money when we married, some from his family, and some that I had saved from my first years at the tailoring shop, where I'd worked before Aldridge Alterations was mine. In 1983, with the shop newly in my name and Herschel's construction work more stable than it had been, we had made some decisions together about what to do with a portion of what we'd saved. Bearer bonds were still available then, instruments of a certain type, pieces of paper that said, "Whoever holds this is owed this amount." They required no name. They were not registered anywhere. They were not in anyone's system. They were simply what they were, tangible and portable and indifferent to the machinery of institutions. We purchased 7 of them, over 3 years, in amounts that ranged from $5,000 to $12,000. Not a fortune. Not a reckless sum. The amount 2 careful people could put aside without endangering what they were building, spread across enough time that it was never a single difficult decision, but rather a series of quiet ones. The bonds went into the lining of the quilt in the fall of 1987. I had been adding to the quilt since 1981 and had just attached a new section of lining, and the geometry of it was exactly right. A pocket, essentially, stitched closed with the same cotton thread I used throughout, indistinguishable from the structural stitching of the lining itself. You would have to know to look. You would have to know where and how and what you were feeling for when your fingers ran over the surface. The letter was from me to myself. 1 page. the blue ink of the pen. It said what the bonds were, the denomination of each, where they could be redeemed, and through what institution. It said what year they had been purchased, and what the original amount was. At the bottom, one sentence, which I had written last after everything else, in the same even hand I used for everything. These are yours. They have always been yours. I wrote that sentence for a reason I did not entirely understand in 1987, but that I understood better by the time it needed to be true. It was not dramatic when I wrote it. It was practical. It was a note to myself that said, should you ever need this to be clearly and unambiguously yours, it is. Should anyone ever tell you that what you built was not yours to have, here is the evidence otherwise. Women of my mother's generation had needed that evidence, in ways I hoped I would not. I hoped I would not need it. I was glad I had it anyway. By the time Roy Hatcher pulled a small seam at the corner of the lining, and Carol ran her practical home economics fingers over the stiff interior and said something is in here. This isn't right. Those 7 bonds had been accruing interest for 36 years. I had checked, quietly, in the months after Herschel died, as part of the general accounting of what we had and what I would need going forward. I had called the institution named in the letter and spoken to a woman there who was professional and thorough, and who confirmed what I already suspected. The bonds were worth, with interest, something approaching $200,000. That is the number I said to Whitney when she sat across from me at the white oak table on that October Saturday morning, with her coffee from the place on Elm Street steaming between her hands and rain coming down against the kitchen window, and Brandon sitting quiet beside me, with the particular steadiness of a man who has already made his peace with whatever this moment requires. I am getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you the rest in the order it happened. I drove home from the diner with the paper bag on the passenger seat. I did not open it in the car. I drove home with it sitting there the way you drive with something that matters, attentively, both hands on the wheel, taking nothing for granted. I brought it inside and went directly to the sewing room, and I set the bag on the table beside the Bernina, and I stood there for a moment in the late afternoon light. Then I sat down at my machine, not to sew, just to sit, just to be in the room where I have always been most myself, at the table where my best thinking happens, with the smell of cedar and machine oil and the faint warmth of afternoon sun through the north window, the thread rack behind me, the fabric bolts sorted by weight and then by color, the wooden button box in the corner with its mismatched contents, everything where it had always been, everything that had always been mine. I took the bonds and the letter out of the bag and I set them on the table. The bonds were cream-colored, slightly yellowed, with the serious formal print of documents from a more formal era. The letter was still in its original fold, the creases gone soft. I unfolded it and read it. My own handwriting from 1987, even and careful, a little younger looking than my writing now, but recognizably mine. These are yours. They have always been yours. I refolded the letter. I put everything in a new envelope, plain white, the kind I use for bills. I addressed it to myself on the front, my own name in my own hand, which is an unusual thing to do, but which felt correct. Then I set the envelope on the corner of the machine table and I left it there while I thought. What I was thinking about was not money, or not only money. I was thinking about a question that had been forming in the back of my mind since the Saturday morning. Whitney had called me with the sound of the garage sale behind her voice, the faint noise of people moving through your possessions, deciding what is worth $8 and what is worth nothing. The question was, at what point does a person decide that what belongs to someone else is theirs to evaluate? At what point does being helpful become being in charge? And how long had Whitney been making that slide? And had I enabled it by stepping back? And what was the right response to it? Not the punitive response, not the performatively patient response, but the true and accurate response from the woman I actually was. I did not answer those questions that night. I sat at my machine for an hour and I thought, and then I went to bed, and in the morning I had a clearer idea of what the conversation needed to be. I called Whitney on a Monday. She answered on the first ring. I need you to come to the house, I said. Saturday morning. I've asked Brandon to be here too. A beat. Her voice was careful in the way it gets when she knows she has done something. Mom, about the Saturday, I said. We'll talk then. I spent the week between that call and the Saturday morning doing two things. The first was the practical work. I called the attorney, Gerald Park, whose office I had used for various matters over the years, and whose face across a conference table I had always found reassuring, because he had the expression of someone who had heard most things and was no longer surprised by any of them. I described the situation. He did not ask me to repeat any of it. He gave me a list of what I would need to bring and what to expect, and how the redemption process would work, and I wrote it down in the small green notebook I use for important things, the one I've been using since 2009, because it has exactly the right weight to the paper. The second thing I did was begin the new quilt. I want to tell you about this carefully, because I do not want it to sound like a metaphor, though I understand it functions as one. I'd been thinking about the new quilt since that night at my machine, sitting in the room that had always been mine and looking at the empty shelf where the old one had been. The new one would be different. Not a repository, not a hiding place. I no longer needed a hiding place in the same way, and anyway, I understood now that the hiding place had been temporary all along, something held safe until the moment it needed to become simply itself, simply what it was. The new quilt was going to be for warmth and for keeping and for the kind of beauty that comes from things that have been used. I pulled from the fabric bolts and from the scrap basket and from the place in the closet where I had kept, without examining, 3 of Herschel's shirts since the fall of 2019, when I could not yet decide what to do with them. The gray and burgundy check he had worn on Saturday mornings, soft flannel, the collar worn to threads where the fold had rubbed for decades, a blue chambray he had worn to the hardware store, a white and cream stripe I associated with Sunday lunches in summer. With the smell of whatever he had been grilling through the back screen door, I cut the first pieces on Thursday night and spent Friday pinning the layout on the cutting table. By Saturday morning, when Brandon arrived from the airport and Whitney came at 9:15 with her coffees, I had a beginning. Brandon slept in his old room Thursday night. We had dinner together, a simple one. Soup from the freezer and the good bread from the bakery 2 streets over. And afterward we sat at the white oak table and he asked me how I was, really, the way he asks when he means the question. I told him I was working something out. He said he could tell, but that I seemed clear. I said I was clear. He said, "Do you want me to do anything Saturday? Say anything?" "No," I said. "Just be there." He nodded. He understood what being there meant, as a category of action distinct from speaking or intervening. Saturday came with the smell of rain in it, one of those October mornings where the air is cold enough to feel deliberate, like the weather has decided on something. Whitney arrived at 9:15 precisely, which meant she had been thinking about being on time. She brought coffee from the place on Elm Street, the good one, the one I prefer, and set 3 cups on the white oak table the way you set things on a table when you are trying to communicate through objects that you understand the gravity of a situation. She sat. Brandon sat. I sat in Herschel's chair. The envelope was in my cardigan pocket. I didn't take it out immediately. I let the moment find its own level. "I met with Roy Hatcher this week," I said. Whitney wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. Her knuckles. She has my knuckles. The same shape. I noticed these things. "Mom, I didn't know there was anything." "I know you didn't," I said. She stopped. "That's the part I'd like us to talk about." Brandon was looking at the surface of the table between his hands, the slight grain of the white oak. He was present in the way he always is, entirely there, taking up exactly the space he needs, adding nothing unnecessary. "When your father and I got married," I said, "we made some decisions about how to keep certain things. Not because we were hiding from you. We didn't have you yet. We made them because we were building something, and not everything in a structure needs to be visible to the people who live in it." I paused. Let that sit. You can live in a house for 30 years and never need to think about the foundation until the day you do. Whitney's eyes moved to the envelope she could now see in my hand. I hadn't noticed taking it out of my pocket. My hands had decided before I did. "What is that?" she said. "Quietly now." "A letter I wrote to myself in 1987, I said. The rain had begun outside. The kitchen window, the one above the sink, tapped with the soft irregular sound of the earliest part of a storm, the drops still large and spaced. "Mom," Whitney said, and her voice was different. Not the managerial voice, not the efficient problem-solving voice. Something younger, something I hadn't heard in a while. I didn't know there was anything inside it. I looked at it and I thought it was worn, and it was taking up space, and I thought you wouldn't miss it. I thought I was helping. "I know," I said. "That's what I'm trying to tell you." I set the envelope on the table between us. I placed it, not pushed it, just set it in the space the three of us shared, on the wood her father had built. "The quilt had bearer bonds sewn into the lining," I said. 7 of them, purchased between 1983 and 1989. With interest accrued over 36 years, they are worth just under $200,000. The refrigerator hummed, Brandon's breath slow beside me, the rain on the window. Whitney's face did something I had not seen it do in a long time. Not guilt exactly, though, that was in there. Not the managerial expression, the one that calculates how to address a problem. Something else. The expression of a person who has been looking at a landscape from the wrong direction for a long time and has just turned around, and the view is completely different from here, and the adjustment is larger than she expected. She put her coffee down. She did not pick it up again. "I didn't know," she said. Not an argument. A confession. A person standing in the full weight of a thing they had done that they would not have done if they had known. "No," I said. "You didn't." "Why didn't you ever tell me it was—" "Because it wasn't time," I said, "and then it became necessary." I want to be fair to Whitney here. Fairness is not the same as forgiveness, and I can practice both at once, and I want to be clear that I am practicing both. She had not sold the quilt out of cruelty. She is not cruel. She had sold it out of certainty, the certainty of someone who is very good at evaluating systems, and who had looked at something worn and ugly and old and seen only what it looked like, not what it was. That is a specific kind of error, and it is very common, and it is almost always a learned one. No one had ever shown her to ask, when she held something made by hand, "What is this holding that I can't see?" That was partly my failure. I had been careful to protect the thing. I had been less careful to teach her to see it, the genuinely human thing I saw in my daughter that morning. The thing I want to tell you about, because she is not simple and this is not a simple story, was the 2 minutes after the silence. She pressed her fingertips to the edge of the table, Herschel's table, and she sat in what she had done without trying to reorganize it. She did not immediately ask how to fix it. She did not reach for her phone. She did not reframe the narrative into something more manageable. She just sat in it, and I watched her do that, and I thought, there is more of her father in her than she shows. She looked up at me finally. Her eyes were bright. "What do you need from me, Mom?" she said. "Not what are you going to do? Not is there paperwork? Not what's the plan? Just what do you need from me?" With the particular weight of someone who is trying, for the first time in a while, to ask a question they don't already know the answer to. "I need you to understand," I said, "that this house is mine. The contents of this house are mine. When I am ready to change anything about that, I will tell you. Until then, nothing leaves here without my hand in it." She nodded. Once, slowly. "And I need you to know," I said, "that I'm not angry." She looked at me. "I'm not," I said. "You did what you understood to do. I just need you to understand more." Brandon got up quietly and refilled the coffees. He did it the way he does everything. Without comment, without drawing attention to the gesture, just noticing that a thing was needed, and doing it. He set the cups back and sat, and we drank, and the rain came harder against the window, and the kitchen filled with the smell of wet leaves, drifting in around the gap in the back door frame that Herschel had always meant to reseal, and that I had also never gotten around to. We sat there for a while, the 3 of us, at the table her father built. The bonds were redeemed over the following months, through a process I will spare you the tedium of. There was documentation involved, in Gerald Park, and several conversations with a patient young man at the financial institution, who seemed to find the situation mildly interesting from a professional standpoint. Everything moved in the order it needed to move. The money went into accounts in my name. Some of it I have plans for. The house, certain repairs I'd been putting off, a contribution to Brandon's children's education that I had been wanting to make for years. Some of it I am simply letting sit. The way you let a finished piece of work sit before you decide what to do with the next one. It is not a dramatic sum by some people's standards. By mine, it is exactly sufficient, which is the best thing money can be. Whitney has called every week since that Saturday. The calls are different now. She still brings the organizational energy. She cannot help it. It is constitutive of who she is, and I would not want to change it. But there is something underneath it now, a listening quality that was not there before. She pauses sometimes, before she offers a suggestion. She asks, more often than she used to, what I think. Last month she asked me about the sewing room, not to reorganize it. She wanted to know what I was working on, and I told her about the new quilt, not everything about it, just that I had started it, and what it was made from, including her father's shirts. There was a silence on the line. The plaid one, she said. The flannel one he wore on Saturdays. That one, yes, I said. Another silence. Longer. Mom. Her voice had the careful quality it gets when she is about to say something she has not rehearsed. When it's done, can I see it? Yes, I said. When it's done. She said, okay. And then, a moment later, I'm sorry, Mom. I know I've said it. I keep wanting to say it again. I hear you, I said. Every time. Roy Hatcher and Carol came to the house in December near Christmas because I invited them, and because it felt right to meet in a home and not a diner. I made a ham. Carol brought a chocolate pecan pie, the kind where the middle has to set exactly right or the whole thing fails, and it set exactly right, and we sat at the white oak table and ate and talked about their grandchildren and my children and the neighborhood and what they were planning for next year's garden, and what I was planning for Herschel's rosebush in the spring. Roy asked about the sewing room. I showed it to him. The burnina, the thread rack, the fabric bolts. He looked at everything with the careful, respectful attention of someone who doesn't know much about a craft, but understands that the space of it matters. Carol stood at the window and looked at the light. This is why the stitching is so fine, Carol said. Not to me, really. To herself. The light in here. And practice, I said. She smiled. She had the smile of someone who had spent decades in a classroom and knew the difference between people who attributed results to conditions and people who attributed them to work. When they left, Carol held my hand at the door for a moment. She said, I'm glad it came back to you. It never really left, I said. Which was true. The quilt had been in someone else's house for 8 days. The things inside it had never been anywhere but mine. She squeezed my hand and let it go, and Roy helped her down the porch steps in the December dark with the easy, practiced attentiveness of someone who had been doing that for a long time and did not find it remarkable. I watched them walk to their car. The street was quiet. The neighborhood holiday lights were on in the houses across the way. The particular gentleness of December light in windows. The quilt is back on the shelf above the burnina. I laundered it by hand. Cool water. The gentlest soap I have, pressed flat to dry on the table in the sewing room. I found where Carol had opened the seam, the small, precise cut she had made at the corner of the lining. It was done with care. The cut was clean. The threads were not pulled, just separated at one point to allow a look inside. The work of someone who knew how to handle something without damaging it. I re-stitched it with a thread so close to the original color that I had to look twice in the good light to find where the repair was. You cannot see it now. You would have to know. The new quilt is coming along. I work on it in the evenings mostly after the day's other work is done, the light good enough from the lamp on the right side of the burnina. The pieces of Herschel's shirts are in the 3rd row from the top, where they will be visible but not dominant, where they will be part of the whole without being the point of it. The flannel of the Saturday shirt is softer than I remembered when I cut it. I had to be careful with the pins. I'm putting nothing inside this one. Nothing except batting and backing and the rows of quilting stitches that hold everything together from the inside, invisible when the quilt is finished but present throughout, running through every layer, the thing that makes the whole thing hold. There is a question I have been sitting with, in the evenings at my machine, that I am going to leave you with, rather than answer, because I think you already know the answer, and I think you will recognize it when you hear it. The question is, what is the value of a thing that was made by hand over time, from the remnants of other things, by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and never felt the need to explain it? What is its value when no one who sees it knows how to look? When it is worn and imperfect and ugly to a certain eye, and sitting on a shelf where someone with a clipboard might look at it and see only, "This can go." I do not believe my daughter is unusual. I believe she is entirely usual. I believe there are Whitneys in most families, people who love you and who have also, somewhere along the way, learned to evaluate instead of look, to manage instead of witness, to decide what is worth $8 without ever asking what might be on the inside. And I believe there are Roy Hatchers, too, and Carols, people who pick up a thing and feel the difference, who notice what their hands are telling them, who make the call instead of setting the thing down and walking away. The difference between those two kinds of people is not intelligence. It is not goodness. It is whether anyone ever taught them to stop and feel the weight of what they're holding before they decide what it's worth. I sit at my machine in the evenings with the lamp on the right and the thread the color of winter wheat and the pieces of my husband's shirts in the growing work under my hands. The room smells of cedar and machine oil and the old particular comfort of a place that has known you for a long time. The flywheel turns. The needle finds the seam. I have been making things for 69 years. I have been making them carefully, with good materials, with attention to what holds and what will last. Some of what I've made has been beautiful. Some of it has been useful. Some of it has contained things that other people could not see and did not know to look for. All of it took practice. All of it took time. All of it required hands that knew the difference between the surface of a thing and what it held. It is easy to throw something away when no one ever taught you how to look at it. The lamp is warm on my right side. The seam runs even under the needle, line by line, one careful length at a time. I know what I'm making. I know what it will hold. I stitch. The work goes on.